Somewhere in your business right now, there's a piece of work sitting in limbo. Not because anyone on your team isn't clever enough to solve it, but because nobody owns it and nobody has accountability for it. So HR says it's a finance question, and finance says it's an HR question. And IT says they'll look at it once someone confirms whose budget it sits in. You know the score. You've heard it time and time again. And so it waits. It's not urgently broken, it's just quietly stuck in the gap between two boxes on an organizational chart. Now, how many of you can relate to that situation? So, what I wanted to do in today's edition of Impactful Teamwork is unlock some of Deloitte's 2026 Human Capital Survey trends, because they've put a number on that feeling of what happens when something is stuck between two different functions or departments in the organization. And this is really telling. 66% of C-suite leaders say that it's very or extremely important for their organization to push beyond the boundaries of traditional functions like HR, finance, legal, IT. And yet only 7% say they're making any real progress in disbanding this old structure of how we used to lead organizations and creating something new. There's an incredible 59% point gap between leaders knowing that something is broken and leaders actually doing something about it. So this is a massive gap in business right now. And this is what we are going to unpack today in today's edition of Impactful Teamwork. We're actually asking the question that most leadership teams avoid, which is, have organizational functions, the departments, the boxes, the reporting lines, have they actually outlived their function? And if they have, what replaces them? And I want to look at this through a new lens for you, because I believe the answers to many of today's business problems lie in nature. So we are going to look at some of these challenges through the lens of nature. Because in my horse herd, they've never had an HR department, and yet the herd coordinates, adapts, and survives in a way that most businesses would actually envy. So let's just wind back the clock a minute. The HR function, the finance function, the IT, the legal team, the procurement team. These functions were designed originally for dependability, efficiency, and specialism. And each one became its own discipline with its own language and its own systems and its own career ladder. And for a long time, that has worked. And it gave organizations depth. It gave people a clear professional identity. And in the old industrial world, which was much more slower moving, this depth was a competitive advantage. But today, the environment is very different. And these functions are now under serious strain. And the strain is coming from two directions simultaneously. And the first is cost. Over the last 3 years, headcounts in HR, sales support, and business management have shrunk considerably. And US public companies have cut their white-collar workforce by 3.5%. More than half of organizations now run finance, HR, IT, and procurement through global business services. So that concept of a shared or outsourced delivery. And 58% expect that footprint to grow even further. And while there is a dedicated global business services leader, more than half of organizations report savings of over 21%. So what does this mean? It means that functions are getting leaner, cheaper, and more efficient. And yet there's this second direction going on. Because over 50% of executives say that their corporate functions are in need of substantial reinvention, not tweaking, reinvention of both capability and mission. And almost 50% of these people point to the same root cause, as to why reinvention isn't happening. And the reinvention isn't happening because of their own organizational structure being the main barrier and people being unwilling to work across the old boundaries that existed. So what does that mean? It means the structure is the barrier to fixing the structure. A bit of a non sequitur there, right? When the structure is the barrier to fixing the structure. So when we look at work in this way, like Deloitte do in this report, what happens as work gets automated or augmented with AI or consolidated into shared services is what is left in many functions are domain experts, people with real specialist expertise. But the problem is they now sit outside of the core value chain. And it's not that they're doing less valuable work, they're doing incredibly valuable work, but it's increasingly becoming disconnected from where the business actually creates value. So this isn't just a small problem in organizations. This is a big problem because it means it shapes the entire workforce and how people's contribution is acknowledged within the workplace. So Deloitte offer a new lens in which to look at the workforce. And this is that they split the business of work into two distinct categories, running the business and growing the business. So let's look at each of these. Running the business is the repeatable stuff, payroll, compliance, vendor management, routine reporting. And these are the kind of activities that look pretty similar regardless of what function they sit in, whether they sit in HR or finance or IT. Transaction handling is transaction handling, regardless of the department it happens in. Risk and compliance is risk and compliance, regardless of the team that it happens in. So what we're saying here is with this repeatable stuff, the work doesn't actually care in which department's name is on the door. So this is the type of work that is really ripe for automation, for shared services, and increasingly for leveraging with AI. Growing the business is very different. It's about planning for new market entry, executing a merger, launching a product, deploying AI across the organization. And this kind of work doesn't respect departmental boundaries at all. It needs all of the departments like finance and IT and HR and supply chain pulling in the same direction, often with the same people involved across more than one of the domains at the same time. And here's the irony. Most organizations are built around this repeatable stuff. Functions, reporting lines, and budgets are all very neatly divided by discipline. And the structure that we've got is genuinely good at running the business. But this is the kicker. It's actually very poor for growing the business. And for many of you, growing the business is the thing and the work that really matters right now. So I'd just like you to think about this for a minute. If you mapped out everything your organization did in a quarter and sorted it into running and growing, would your current structure still make sense for both? Or have you built a really efficient machine for running the business and then asked the same machine to do something it was never designed for? In other words, reinventing. So let's just look at how something in nature, the horse herd, operates. Because the horse herd doesn't have an HR department, it doesn't have a finance department or an IT team or a procurement officer. And yet the herd navigates predators, terrain, weather, and the competing needs of everyone in the herd with a level of coordination that most businesses would die for. So here in my business, Business Horsepower, we look at this through the lens of the diamond model of shared leadership inspired by the work of Teaching Horse. Because what we see in horse herds is that the leadership rotates depending on what is required in the moment. This is why I continually am talking about shared leadership. Different members of the team lead from the front, lead from the side, or lead from behind, depending on what is going on, but everyone is always moving in alignment behind a shared vision. So in the horse herd, nobody holds the permanent title of leader. Leadership moves wherever it is needed. And actually, when we look at the diamond model, the most important position in the diamond model isn't the leader, it's the fact that it's all about attention. The capacity to read the environment, to sense the energy of the group and notice what isn't being said. And the thing is, in the wild, this isn't a soft skill, it's actually survival, because the herd member who isn't paying attention is the one who the predator takes, and is the one who puts the whole herd in danger. So how does that relate to Deloitte's thoughts on running the business versus growing the business? If you want to think about it a little bit like this, running the business is the herd's baseline. That's all about grazing, moving together, steady rhythms that don't need anyone to lead in an active sense. And it all just happens because the system is designed for it. Growing the business is what occurs the minute the predator appears. And here's the thing, of course, the herd doesn't convene a cross-functional steering committee to agree whose responsibility the predator is. It doesn't ask, is this a security issue or an operational issue? The horse with the clearest read of the threat moves, and everyone else follows. Not because of title, not because of department, because right now, this is where the leadership is needed. And yet, in most organizations that I work with and I have been part of, the first question that often lands when something urgent happens is, who's best placed to lead this right now? Whose department is this? And I've heard that single question asked 100 times a day in 100 different meetings. And it takes enormous amount of organizational energy. And this is where the energy starts leaking away, not in one dramatic failure, but in 1,000 small delays, each one almost invisible and each one completely avoidable. So I want to share with you a story of something that I observed when I used to live down in Sussex, because I had a lot of horse riders that used to come and ride past my house. And just down the road from my house was quite a fancy dressage yard where a lot of very wealthy ladies kept their horses. And there was one particular lady that I used to see regularly out riding her horse. And every time she used to come past the house, I could just see the look of fear and terror on her face. She was so tense. And her horse was really tense too. It was braced. It was ready for something that wasn't going to actually happen. But the horse in its mind, I'm surmising, was thinking that there was danger just around the corner, and it was braced to run. And this woman was absolutely braced on top of it. And one day when she's riding right past the house, I just said to her, could you just breathe for a moment? And as she took that breath and exhaled, she visibly relaxed and the horse visibly relaxed as well. And I think this is what we're seeing happening in organizations right now. We're seeing this underlying level of tension when work gets stuck between departments, when nobody quite owns it, when everyone's covering themselves rather than solving the problem. And this tension, it has to go somewhere, it has to get absorbed. And typically, unfortunately, I'm seeing it's the manager who ends up picking this up on top of their own workload. Or it might even be the customer who ends up waiting extra time for some delivery and they don't even know why. So it's in these interactions between the departments that momentum is getting lost. And Deloitte's Human Capital Survey 2026 exactly describes this scenario when it talks about a CEO preparing for a major product expansion. And it's needing an integrated financial, workforce, and supply chain plan. And finding that functional capacity is limited, capability is mismatched, and the data simply doesn't join up across the functions involved. Meanwhile, the functional headcount and the leadership layers have expanded over time, adding cost without adding growth. And so this is the tension that actually we're seeing showing up now on the balance sheets within organizations. My horses can't hide what they're carrying, but given enough time, neither can your business. The problem is it just takes longer to notice in the business that there's this cost going on of this lack of collaboration and accountability going on. So what's the alternative? As I read the Deloitte Human Capital Survey, I was really excited because the alternative that they describe sounds a lot like the second lever of my unbridled teamship roadmap. It's what I call impactful contribution. Because Deloitte recommend that you decouple domain experts from organizational structure. So what does that mean in plain terms? It means stop locking your best thinking inside a single department and start letting people apply what they know wherever the business actually needs it. And this is exactly what a tool like the GC Index is built for. It maps 5 different proclivities for impact: game changer, strategist, implementer, polisher, and playmaker. And just as an aside, notice that none of those neatly fit into finance or HR or operations. Because you might have a brilliant game changer sitting in your procurement team right now, quietly underused because procurement has never asked anyone for game-changing thinking before. Their function has absolutely nothing to do with actual contribution. The good news is, though, we're already seeing forward-thinking organizations acting in a new way. And let me give you some examples here. Moderna has merged HR and IT under a single chief people and digital technology officer and deployed thousands of tailored AI tools to take routine work off people's plates. When this frees up the capacity for people to work across boundary instead of staying neatly within them. Unilever too has recently given its CFO responsibility not just for finance, but for supply chain, procurement, digital, and business services as part of a 5-year growth plan. And at Cisco, Vice President of People Megan Brazen has adopted what she calls dynamic teaming. So these are cross-functional squads of humans and AI agents assembled around a problem rather than a department, with the static team, in her words, becoming a thing of the past. Also an example from a company called Workly, which is an AI talent platform. They were struggling to give a consistent experience to a globally distributed workforce. And the fix wasn't a bigger HR team or a bigger IT team. It was bringing HR and IT expertise together to redesign onboarding and daily support as one experience, not 2 different handovers and departments within the organization. So when we think about the herd, the lead mare isn't the logistics horse or the security horse. She leads because right now she has the clearest read of the ground ahead. Tomorrow, leadership might shift to a completely different horse. The thing is, nothing about her identity changes. What changes is what's needed. And the herd lets it change without anyone losing the status for stepping back. And of course, this is the biggest challenge that we see in organizations. One of the reasons that I don't see a lot of this change happening is because leaders are fearful of losing their status. Leadership is still driven a lot by ego, and therefore the leader doesn't want to step back because they have some worries about what the ramifications of that for them. Now, I also want to be really realistic here. I don't think it is as simple as dissolve every department and everyone will be fine. These structures are embedded into our organizational cultures and hierarchy and has been for many years. There's always going to be a need in your organization for human expertise, for people expertise, for capability and courageous independent perspectives. The role of the CFO or the CHRO or the chief legal officer often, let's face it, includes delivering an unpopular opinion to the leadership team in the interests of protecting the wider business. And it's really important that we acknowledge that type of stewardship and that any redesign that erodes that decision making isn't progress. We're just creating a different type of risk. And Deloitte further goes on to talk about the real obstacle here is turf. Leaders hoping to reimagine functions have to be clear-eyed about the human tendency to protect territory and political power, regardless of how agile or cost-effective a new structure might be on paper. And this is where my lovely pony Bracken teaches something very special, because Bracken is my boundary teaching expert. And if you're unclear about what you actually want, if your intention is vague, or you're trying to avoid a difficult decision, she'll barge straight into you, not aggressively, just directly. She makes the lack of clarity impossible to ignore. And so we often talk a lot about turf protection, but turf protection isn't really about the turf at all. It's really about what happens when the intention is unclear, when nobody has said plainly what the function is doing right now and who's accountable for it. When people don't know this type of thing, they don't understand the context of why and when and how something's happening, people default to what they currently have because it's the only certainty available to them. So when we decouple expertise from structure, it isn't really a structural exercise first, it's a clarity exercise. Game-changing trust is the first lever of the unbridled teamship roadmap, and it has to come before impactful contribution can do its work. Because without trust and clarity, phrases like let's work across boundaries sound like just make my role smaller, and people will entirely reasonably resist that. So this brings us to the third lever in the unbridled teamship roadmap, which is unbridled adaptability. Because most teams sit somewhere on a spectrum between toxic to turbocharged. And at each of the different levels, 4 levels, we have a different leadership mode that's driving that. It might be controlling, coaching, connecting, or co-creating. And this largely determines how the team is going to show up. At the simple end of the spectrum, we've got enhanced collaboration. So more cross-functional representation of how teams work, some shared metrics, but the underlying structure stays largely as it is. That's controlling. It's just got some slightly loosened edges around it. In the middle, there's solution-based learning. So teams built around a specific business scenario, like a merger or a new market entry or product launch, they draw people in across the functions as long as that scenario needs them to be there. And the complex end is what we call reimagination. It's about running the business capabilities under common leadership, enabled by integrated technology and AI, while growing the business capabilities and organization into a fluid solution-based team or experience services partnership supported by domain experts. So that's all about co-creating the future. So at Highmark Health, Marissa Oglen, who is the Senior VP of Enterprise HR, described forming what they have called a workplace innovation team. And this is all about deconstructing jobs, identifying where technology fits, and reconstructing roles across the functions. From nursing to customer service, The more cross-functional and integrated our teams are, the more trust and collaboration become strategic assets rather than accidental byproducts. And if you as an organization want a network culture, you really have to figure out how you're going to create connections and get visibility within the organization. And my horse herd doesn't hold a defensive position all day, every day, regardless of whether there's really a threat. When trust is high and nothing's wrong, the herd relaxes. Individuals graze further apart. Intentions soften, energy is conserved. But when something shifts, it tightens back up fast and reorganizes around who's ever needed. The structure isn't fixed, it's responsive to the environment. And that's the difference between a herd and an organizational chart. One adapts in real time, the other has to be redrawn, reapproved, and rolled out. And usually this takes months or even years to complete. So what have we been talking about here today? Because none of this means that we need to rip up your organizational chart tomorrow. But it might mean sitting with a few questions such as, where this month has this piece of work got stuck purely because of whose department it is? And it's often not because the work was hard, it's because nobody was clearly positioned to lead it. There was no accountability. And you might want to consider mapping your own activities into running the business and growing the business. So 2 columns. What do I need to grow the business? What do I need to run the business? And really assess whether your current structure makes sense for both. Or have you overbuilt one machine and not built the other one? Because these 2 concepts of machines are required to do very different jobs. And you also might want to consider where in your business is someone currently being treated as, for example, the logistics person or the finance person or the IT person. And what's it going to take for them to develop the skills so that they can coordinate and organize the team going forward? So here's the thought and the provocation that I'd like to leave with you today. The organizational chart was designed for a world that moved more slowly than the one we're in today, a world where specialization mattered more than speed, and where whose job is it was perfectly reasonable. As I said, my herd has never had an organizational chart. It's been managing and navigating uncertainty at speed for millions of years by letting leadership move to where the attention is needed. So maybe today the real question isn't how do we redesign our functions? Maybe it's whether functions is even the right word for what comes next, or whether what we actually need is teamship. So if this episode of Impactful Teamwork has got you thinking, where is your team carrying the tension? Where is the energy leaking? I'd like to invite you to book a Turbocharge Your Team audit. You can book this at businesshorsepower.com/quiz. And we'll work out the next step together. And if you want to learn more about the Unbridled Teamship Roadmap, I suggest that you, first of all, go and take the Turbocharge Your Team audit at businesshorsepower.com/, and then continue to subscribe to this podcast to Impactful Teamwork, where in other episodes we'll really be unpacking what does game-changing trust look like within an organization, what does impactful teamwork really mean, and what is unbridled adaptability? How does that work in today's organizations? So until next week, I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Impactful Teamwork, and we'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.